I'm having it in on the live stream. It just says ACS chapter stream. It's not showing. On just on the live stream, and I see it on the Zoom. Got it. See that, but see if it shows up now. So take the mic.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back for day 2 of our student convention. Hope y'all enjoyed breakfast. I hear the laughter and conversation in the room. So it looks like people are starting to connect, form friendships and network. We're all so thrilled about that. And thank you so much for your participation in our first day of programming. I am happy to bring us to our first panel of the day on truth, racial healing, and transformation. So to set a bit of context for that, as I'm sure we all know and have been experiencing, we are in a hugely historic moment that we've been living through in the past, I'd say 5 years or so, with resurgent interest and attention to some of the past injustices in the United States around racial justice and racialized injustice specifically. We're seeing increased attention to the role of genocide of Native Americans and removal, the legacy of slavery, and how those harms persist to the present day. And at ACS, as well as in our network, we're starting to think more deeply about not just day-to-day individual experiences of discrimination and injustice, but how our larger systems have played a role in that and continue to play that role, and how we as lawyers have a unique role to play, how many of these forms of injustice were legal at the time. So saying that something is legal or illegal has not always correlated to what is right in this country. And also, what role does the law have to play in actually addressing those forms of injustice and in building a better future? Also huge topics. So today we've got panelists who are hard at work in this arena and think about the ways that you can actually make this concrete as you think on the course of your careers. They come from academia, they come from policy, they've worked in media, they've worked in government. So super excited to hear their wisdom today. And also to, after that conversation, hear your questions about how you can connect and how it relates to your various roles and across your career. So without further ado, I'll introduce our stunning panelists. We will hear from Don Tamaki. Don Tamaki is senior counsel at Minami Tamaki LLP. He received his bachelor's and his law degree from Berkeley. He co-founded the Asian Law Alliance in San Jose and served as the executive director of the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. In the 80s, Don was a member of the pro bono legal team that reopened the landmark 1944 Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu. It led to the overturning of Mr. Korematsu's criminal conviction for defying the incarceration of almost 120,000 Japanese Americans. He also co-founded Stop Repeating History, which works to educate the public on the dangers of unchecked presidential power and draws parallels between the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and the Trump administration policies targeting minority groups based on race and religion. He is currently serving on a task force appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom in California, the California Reparations Task Force, which studies the historic and present-day impact of over 250 years of enslavement, Jim Crow, segregation, and its vestiges, and is working to see what California can do to redress these harms. So a moment to give it up for Don Tamaki. We are also going to hear from Rebecca Sosi. She is Regents Professor at the James Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona. She's of Yaqui descent and is a faculty member for the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program at the University of Arizona. She's widely known for her work in the fields of federal Indian law and Indigenous peoples' human rights. Prior to joining the University of Arizona faculty, she was Regents Professor for Inclusion and Community Engagement at Arizona State University. She was the first executive director of ASU's Indian Legal Program and served in that position for 15 years. She's been published widely on issues of sovereignty, self-determination, cultural pluralism, environmental policy, and cultural rights. And she now teaches on federal Indian law, property, constitutional law, critical race theory. She is a Supreme Court Justice for the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation, as well as Associate Judge on the San Carlos Tribal Court of Appeals. And she received her BA and her JD from the University of California, Los Angeles. So please give it up for Professor Sosi. And last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Sarah Belton. She is the clinical supervising attorney at the Racial Justice Project and Mills Legal Clinic starting in February 2022. She was previously a supervising deputy attorney general at the California Department of Justice, where she led the Bureau of Children's Justice within the Civil Rights Enforcement section, and her work focused on investigating and litigating children's issues and other civil rights matters. She's worked at Public Justice and has been an Equal Justice Works Fellow, as well as a staff attorney at Legal Services for Children in San Francisco. And she was also a law clerk for Federal District Judge Algernon L. Marbley in Columbus, Ohio. She received her JD from Harvard Law School and also participated there in Child Advocacy Program and the Criminal Justice Institute. And she has a BA in International Relations from Stanford University. So give it up for Ms. Belton. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the hugeness of history, but I also want to give you all a chance in your own words to talk about both the historical and the personal context that brought you to your work. I'll start with Don.
Well, good morning, and thank you, ACS and Tonga, for that gracious introduction. Try to live up to everything you just said. So I guess the question is, as I'm reading it, what it is historical and personal context we bring to this Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation panel. And I'll start with something that was very central to us, and that was reopening the Korematsu case. So as everybody knows, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. By February 19th, 1942, the president issued Executive Order 9066, ultimately leading to the incarceration of almost 120,000 Americans who happened to look like the enemy. And the basis for that was that the Army claimed that Japanese Americans were engaging in espionage and sabotage in the form of radio signaling enemy ships from shore, and were prone to disloyalty because they were an unassimilated population, quote unquote. And later, 37 years later, after the fact that of the Supreme Court ruling on this case, we found out that there was only one thing wrong with this narrative. It was entirely made up, and the government knew it at the time. Nevertheless, all these people were rounded up in 10 concentration camps stretching from California to Arkansas. Among them were Fred Korematsu, my mother and father, an extended family, and many, many, many others. Korematsu was one of the 3 litigants challenging this. And we've all read Korematsu in law school. It's standing for the proposition of what a president can do during times of war. But what most professors don't teach is the backstory of what happened. So in keeping with the theme, truth, racial healing, and transformation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the truth part, because that was what the Korematsu case involved. Fred Gordon Hirabayashi and Minoru Yasui challenged these cases, Fred being the most known case. And the government defended against his challenge, again, that Japanese Americans were disloyal and were actually spying. In 1944, his case wound its way up to the US Supreme Court. And to his shock, he lost the court ruling in a 6-3 decision that the government had every right to lock up these Americans because it was a, quote, military necessity. Fast forward 37 years. Peter Irons, then a professor, and Aiko Yoshinaga Herzig, researching archives, stumbled upon, quite by accident, Justice Department memos, intelligence reports from the FBI, the Federal Communications, and the Navy, all which concluded that Japanese Americans had committed no wrong, and Justice Department memos from the highest people within the Justice Department urging the Solicitor General not to lie to the US Supreme Court. And obviously, you know, our narrative when we learned Korematsu was that it was a, quote, military necessity. Japanese Americans like my family came to the conclusion that this was racial wartime hysteria, and at best, it was a mistake. But what these documents indicated was this was no mistake. This was more or less a calculated plan to manipulate the outcome of a major Supreme Court decision, even if it meant lying to the US Supreme Court. And Justice Department memos, basically whistleblower memos, had said there's no doubt that the Army's claims are, quote, intentional falsehoods, and urged the Solicitor General to disclose this evidence, concluding that, quote, any other course of conduct might approximate the suppression of evidence. Nonetheless, these memos and imploring pitches to higher ups all the way to the Attorney General were ignored. And so Justice Department lawyers inserted a footnote in the Korematsu brief and basically saying that we have in our possession intelligence reports indicating that the Army's claims are contradicted. The footnote was deleted, and the last attempt to alert the court that something was wrong failed. So on this basis, a legal team in the 1980s reopened Korematsu versus the United States, and Ed Chen, who was then ACLU attorney, was on that legal team. He now is a federal district court judge for the Northern District of California. You'll hear from him later on this afternoon, was part of that legal team. And it led to Korematsu's a decision by Justice Federal District Court Judge Marilyn Hall Patel vacating that criminal conviction. And so on the truth part, this was really crucial for our community to know what happened and know that it wasn't a mistake, but it was an utter failure of three branches of government. Of course, Congress, the presidency, but the judiciary, which is supposed to be a check and balance on the abuses of the other two branches. And that in turn led to, it boosted a 20-year effort that coincidentally was happening at the same time. And that was redress and reparations for Japanese Americans. And the last sort of claim that, you know, that was not warranted because the Supreme Court had ruled on that started to fall away, because basically the ruling demonstrated that this enormous precedent, one of the worst cases in United States Supreme Court history, rested on a foundation of fraud and fabrication. And so that was, I would call it the racial healing part. And then it led to the beginnings of the redress and reparations effort. It boosted it really. And I would say that was the transformation part. So I'm going to stop here, but that's how I come into this work.
Thank you. Mr. Sosi.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this distinguished panel. I am so honored to be here. I've long heard about Donald's work, and it's just really an honor to meet you. That is one of the most horrendous stories in our constitutional history. And I feel sad every time I encounter that history through the voice of somebody who was directly touched by that. So thank you for that tremendous work that you and others have done. And I want to thank all of you. It makes me so happy to see the students here, the young people, caring about these issues, which are so important. And I feel like we are at this time, as you said, Tonga, where we have a choice. We have a choice to pretend that some of these things didn't happen, or to pretend that our constitutional democracy has all of the safeguards that we need so that things like that don't happen again. But although I am personally an optimist, I have to tell you that I have great concern because I still see structural weaknesses. And I think that your generation is so good at calling those out, at not, taking some, message to heart that isn't sincere. So thank you for being part of this discussion. I also want to thank my constitutional law students. I'm teaching constitutional law 1 this semester, and the poor things, like they've been working so hard, and some of them are here today. So thank you so much. And how I want to knit together this part of the history is to say that we as professors have a choice to teach property and to teach constitutional law as though Indigenous peoples are not part of this. The narrative in this country has always been about the rights of a citizen. And that's our promise of a constitutional democracy, that you can vote and you can, participate and you can, whatever. Well, I'm here to tell you that today, the racial healing part of it is to acknowledge that we are not equal citizens, that we have these very complicated histories and structural inequities that continue to inform our current experience. So how many students in property read Johnson v. McIntosh? There you go. And not to call on anybody, but there's many ways to teach Johnson v. McIntosh. And many of my colleagues in the academy teach it as though title comes from the government, the United States. Or you could teach it as though, how did the medieval doctrine of discovery that privileges Christian European nations in their voyages of conquest to maintain a title by virtue of quote unquote discovering lands and quote unquote settling them? And somehow that made its way into our property system as the backbone of the United States title. And not to say anything bad about the United States, but didn't they start maybe like 1776? Whereas Indigenous nations were already here, were already living in some of the most complex social and cultural and economic ways of living. So that's the narrative in property. And I understand that the Catholic Church just recently repudiated the doctrine of discovery. And now the whole question is, well, did it contribute to nation states like the United States and Canada? And if so, what follows from that? That's part of that narrative of truth. And then if there's going to be a reconciliation, what do you do with the acknowledgement of that? Constitutional law. How many people took con law and their professor talked about the Indian Commerce Clause in the Commerce Clause? How many people, their professor did not talk about the Indian Commerce Clause? Okay. That's the standard experience. It's all the Commerce Clause. And it says Congress has the power, right? Among the several states to regulate commerce among the several states with foreign nations and with Indian tribes. And each of those political units stands alone, and each of them typically would have a version of what follows from the treaty relationship or from the interstate compacts. That is essential for you to know that there are 574 federally recognized tribes, and that commerce with those indigenous nations has a sovereign character that is distinctive today, but it always existed. Well, what about the tribes that lack federal recognition? What about the Native Hawaiian people? They were an internationally recognized kingdom under a foreign nation construction of the US until, of course, the United States contributed to the demise of the kingdom. There's another story of truth and then reconciliation, but it starts with that educational process. So I got into this because I had federal Indian law as an undergrad student at UCLA. And when I read those cases, I was so angry that that could stand for some principle of justice. And there was in the case book, and I was supposed to master the Marshall Trilogy and cite that as a law. Oh, until recently, because we get the Castro Huerta case in which they say Wooster's no longer good law. Any precedent for that? Nope. That's a Supreme Court case from 2022 that does not have a single case precedent for the holding and disturbs over 200 years of precedent. And I could go page by page and tell you the cases that stand for the opposite of what the court concluded. Well, why did they do that? They essentially, they're said in Oklahoma that the state and the federal government could exercise concurrent jurisdiction. Oh, just because. That is causing major problems in federal Indian law. Jurisdictionally, you have to have those rules. Anybody care about missing and murdered Indigenous women and people? Part of that is because of those gaps in the criminal justice system. But if you don't locate responsibility, it's very hard to knit together those jurisdictional differences. The federal and the tribal governments do not regularly share data with the states. There have to be agreements to do that. And that's where the Commerce Clause comes in handy to know. So all of you that are going to be working, I don't know, for state or federal, even in private practice, these are tools that you will use and you will figure out what we need to do going forward. In my career, I think the other part of your question, Tongva, is how have you, kind of engaged that, and we can move into that discussion. But right now in my work, I'm engaging the legacy of the boarding schools and would like to talk about that at the appropriate time. In a great part of my career, I worked on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was the first enforceable statute protecting Native culture, 1990. Before that time, you could go to a Wild West show in Phoenix or Mesa, and you could see Native American human remains in cases with concho bells and squash blossoms for sale. Now that's trafficking and protected cultural items. But Berkeley is still sitting on 12,000 sets of Native American ancestral human remains. And the history of genocide in California toward the Native people is horrendous. So it is a history of genocide, land dispossession, dispossession of culture and children. And that is a heavy legacy to repair. But I'm an optimist. And I love my students because they never give up, and they have helped me for years and years as we fought to get those regs, to get the laws. And I just honor you all for being part of this experience this morning. Thank you.
So those are hard people to follow. But I want to tell you that history matters, and it matters in practice still in cases that are currently in the sort of cultural phenomenon area. So one example I'd like to talk to you about is family separation. Show of hands, who's familiar with the policy that existed during the Trump administration? Great. So you may remember that in 2017 and 2018, what we started to see were children and youth who had arrived with a parent or a caregiver. That parent or caregiver had been charged with a criminal immigration violation, usually a misdemeanor or a felony. And then what would happen is that the child or youth would be separated, rendered unaccompanied, so treated as an unaccompanied minor in our immigration system, detained in any number of shelter or secure or staff secure facilities, and then potentially released to adults in the United States who might be known family members or might just be an adult that was familiar to the family. It was all over the news, and people were expressing, and rightly expressing, outrage about what was happening in this country. And what I think didn't get enough attention at the time was that this was not the first sort of iteration of the tearing apart of families that we have seen in this country. You've heard Rebecca talk about the boarding schools that for too long separated Native children from their families and their areas with which they were most familiar. It happened during chattel slavery, when children were regularly separated from their parents or caregivers and sold away. And so what I want to say is that this was really relevant. So that you may be familiar with a class action that was filed called Miss L. That was the case that got the most press. It was certified as a class action, and then it went into settlement negotiations and may actually still be in settlement negotiations. While I was at the California Attorney General's office, was part of a multi-state lawsuit that the states brought to also challenge this practice of separating children from their families, because when the children were released, they were released in states like California, where I work, needing a huge amount of services. And in our court papers, what you will find are declarations from experts in history about what had happened and how this had happened before. And I was talking with folks who were going to write amicus briefs in support of our papers, particularly from the Anti-Defamation League, in support of, on behalf of, I should say, folks who during the Holocaust had been separated from their parents and who were forever changed by that experience. And so I think sometimes we hear history and we're like, oh, the olden days, does that really matter for my practice? And too often I have found, and I think you might find when you're in practice, that there's an antecedent or a previous practice that is just replicating itself in a new way. It's a new form of othering under the same type of white supremacist structure that has existed for hundreds of years in this country. And so I try and bring a historical lens to my work, because I think finding out the truth and knowing how we can bring about healing often relies on having the full context. And I think sometimes that means going deeper than just the facts in front of you. Thanks.
Thank you all for setting that context. And I think, as you've mentioned, and I think as we're hearing now from opponents of this kind of work, from both the right and also sometimes from allies, is like, you know, what will digging up history do for us now? Like, okay, it's horrible and it happened, but how does that actually help us now? Because we have bills to pay in the present, we have problems in the present. And so I would love to hear your perspective, or what you can share about the impact that this work has had in communities, and what you've seen in that, especially across the different roles you've held, from academia, from litigation, from media work. What actual impact have you seen in people's lives from this kind of historical analysis?
Am I up next? Yeah, so Sarah Belton is a hard act to follow too. I'm one of the 9 members on the California Reparations Task Force. And Sarah Belton, before she went to a teaching position at Stanford, really structured her Department of Justice legal team in California to produce a groundbreaking, near 500-page comprehensive documentation of the harm of 246 years of enslavement, 90 years of Jim Crow exclusion and racial terror, and decades more of discrimination leading to today's outcomes, which are at once both shocking but not necessarily surprising because of the years of redlining, for instance, in California. If you align those maps of the 1930s and the 1940s with the most impoverished and underserved and most segregated communities in California, they align exactly. So these outcomes very much were planned outcomes, and the aftermath and the consequences people are dealing with today. And I got to give a shout out to Sarah for having the vision to set that in motion. I do want to turn to basically your question, Tonga, about how it impacts other communities and why this reparations issue is so important to everyone. It's not just a, quote, Black issue or an issue of an aggrieved minority that's been characterized by the right as an undeserving minority. And I'll just give you an example of the Japanese American community and why there's a certain high degree, I think, of allyship there. And when I talk to Japanese American communities and AAPIs, I really give them 2 examples historically, because what Sarah's saying about history repeating itself is absolutely true. So the question is to Japanese Americans, why should we, or any other non-Black person for that matter, care about reparations for African Americans? And I answer that question by juxtaposing 2 historical examples. So in 1943, 63-year-old James Wakasa was confined at Topaz concentration camp, along with Fred Korematsu, my mother and father, and about 10,000 other Americans. So one evening, Wakasa decides to take a stroll along the camp's barbed wire fence line. From 300 yards away, a sentry in a guard tower takes aim and fires, the bullet striking Wakasa in the chest and killing him. No inquest was held, and the guard was exonerated after claiming that Wakasa was trying to escape. 2 years later, and this is taken from this report of the California Task Force. In 1945, O'Day Short, his wife Helen, 7-year-old Carol Ann, and 9-year-old Barry moved into a house they built in Fontana, California. Sheriffs warned Short they should go back to their Black neighborhood. His real estate agent advised, vigilantes had a meeting here last night, and if I were you, I'd get my family out of here. 2 weeks later, an explosion engulfed the house. Neighbors saw Helen try to beat back the flames consuming her children. All family members died. The San Bernardino County District Attorney concluded it was an accident. The California Attorney General concluded that no evidence of vigilante activity could be found. Other than the fact that these 2 events occurred within 2 years of each other, the question is, what ties them together? The answer, I think, is that the hate resulting in the deaths of James Wakasa and the Odell Short family has its origins in the racism that propped up the institution of slavery and its aftermath, because slavery has existed for thousands of years, but it was only in the past 400 to 500 years that white Europeans developed a type of enslavement based on skin color that was permanent, inheritable, multi-generational, and upheld by a culture of white superiority. So once the culture of 1619 used race to dehumanize people to the level of pigs and goats, in the words of Martin Luther King, thingifying them, then the most heinous crimes against humanity could follow without a second thought. Following the end of slavery, this cultural norm valuing white lives above all others, morphed into forms of hate that put a target on the backs of not just African Americans, but other people of color, including James Wakasa. So simply put, if you could thingify Black people, then demonizing other disfavored groups is easy. Slavery begat the cultural foundation that created America's racial hierarchy, with white people on top, like Black and Native people on the bottom, and everybody else in between. So as long as this pathology that originated in 1619 remains unredressed, the racial hierarchy that it spawned will numbingly recycle, poisoning the soul of America. And I think that's what Sarah was referring to. And we only need to look at the Trump years to know this is true. When Asian Americans were blamed for the Chinese virus, when Mexicans were called drug dealers and rapists, when Muslims were labeled as terrorists, when white supremacists declared that Jews and immigrants are poised to replace them, and of course, when one more African American is killed at the hands of law enforcement, and it barely evoked a shrug because it is so normal. And so I think this is the solidarity part, if we see these individual acts within the context of a history churning and repeating itself, then we can see this as part of a issue of justice, of fundamental justice that we could all benefit from in terms of standing in solidarity. And so I think in all these movements that we have to find the thread for that messaging.
So the way that I want to reflect on that question is by defining kind of three ideas. The first one is that idea of recognition of people in their status designation. So is race a status designation? And by that, I mean, does it carry political implications? Yes. Are Native people racial groups? How many people think yes? How many people think no? How many people do not know? Okay, thank you. The answer is yes and no, right? So at the recognition level is what is the status of this group or this individual within a group? And the biggest injustice in US history is when the group doesn't have an equal status. And the most dehumanizing, of course, was the institution of American slavery. That was the most dehumanizing. The status of ward was the status of American Indian and Alaska Native people until 1924. They're not natural born citizens, even in the 14th Amendment. They're different because they have a political allegiance to their nations, their indigenous nations, not necessarily the United States. And so that rhetoric of a ward is why their children could be dispossessed and sent to boarding school and the parents couldn't visit them. It's why they were precluded from having an equal education. They couldn't speak their language. They couldn't practice their culture. Their kids sometimes died in the boarding school without any record of what happened or where they are. That's what happens to a ward. The parent has no right to be a parent. The other thing that happens to the ward is that the land can be broken up from the communal landholding, the tribal landholding, allotted, and then the surplus lands could be released. That was the allotment era. United States government had complete control over the property. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is set up first under the Department of War and then under Department of Interior in 1849. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is the entity that removed the Japanese American people and housed them on Gila River Indian Reservation because they knew how to remove a people, dispossess them of their property, and keep them in confinement. American Indian and Alaska Native people had that status till 1924. Then they became United States citizens, but it took until the 1960s to litigate the cases so that they would have equal voting rights under the 15th Amendment. So all of the things that protect racial groups had to be fought for American Indian, Alaska Native people too. So the status of war, today we think of that as the trust responsibility, but it also justifies a federal power and this idea of an indigenous exceptionalism for federally recognized tribes follows from that. So the conversation over energy development, a lot of the tribal nations were saddled with the legacy of coal and uranium mining. The coal and uranium is still on those reservations. In a transitional energy economy, it can be deployed as tribal sovereignty to continue to exploit those resources. So that is what the United States power structure allows with a differentiated status today as a nation within a nation. That's all in the category of recognition, but do you see that there isn't necessarily an account of justice that follows from that? So the next thing is that idea of reparation. What does that mean? And I think that one of the big things it means is that you actually look at the narratives that the people had about what happened to them. The boarding school survivors had a narrative about what happened to them, but there wasn't a documentary record to go with that, just like the archives. Now they're combing through the archives. They're actually using geosensing to see, are there burial grounds that are not marked on the sites? Where were the boarding schools? Because some of them were pop-up. They popped up and then they took the kids in there and swept them out and took them somewhere else. There aren't records. There are no documentary records. Similarly, the Wounded Knee probably is the best example of something that was framed as a war for much of this nation's history until it got reframed as a massacre. And they actually did that. The narrative matched what they found of how the people were running when they were shot in the back. That has happened in so many places. I recently was at a conference and there was a scholar from one of the Plains states who said there was a really bizarre mound in the town. There were no Native people nearby, but the Native people had a narrative about some massacre that had occurred there. They thought that it was buffalo remains, but they did the excavation and it was human remains. So there are places like that scattered throughout the land. And so reparation means you acknowledge that, and that the documentary record that the US government is giving us is not complete. And without that record, it's impossible to reach the next stage, which is that reconciliation stage. The reconciliation stage is the healing stage. To me, that's the most powerful part of it. The work that I did with NAGPRA, when I worked with Native communities that repatriated their ancestors home, that is some of the most moving work that you will ever see. The items, the sacred items, the items of cultural patrimony that were reunited with their communities of origin, allowing that nation to live on in its true identity. Because as long as that's all broken apart and scattered, there is no way for that healing to happen, which is, I think, a spiritual process as well as a political commitment. So it is very powerful with the things that we are talking about. And I want to do that with respect. I know that these are harsh things to talk about and to hear, but they're very important. Thank you.
So I'm going to take us to a different sort of lens on this question, which I'm going to focus on recent policy initiatives that have tried to do some of this truth and racial healing and transformation work. So it's in progress, and apologies, but I'm most familiar with California. So you're going to hear some California examples. One that you may or may not be aware of is the relatively recently passed California Racial Justice Act, which tries to eliminate bias, actual and implicit, from the criminal justice system in California. It was passed in 2020, made retroactive to be phased in starting January 1 of this year. And It's a big task. And I want to stress that it can be a huge and should be recognized as a big victory that this state statute was even passed. And it's also a lot of work and attorney work to make sure that we provide meaning to what's on paper in that act. And so what does that look like recently? So it's like gathering the data, gathering the truth. What do the numbers show? Where are the disparities in charging or in who gets stopped? I will probably not surprise you by telling you that there's a whole bunch of battles across the state in various counties, of which there are 58 in California, about accessing that data. And you got to get the judges to hear the cases, right? It can be challenging for lawyers to do something new that they haven't done before. And sometimes courts are reluctant to want to be the first to hear a novel claim where you are developing the case law as you go along. So that's one thing that's happening. Second, you heard from Dawn about the reparations task force. Again, we got a statute that was passed and signed into law in September of 2020. The task force met for the first time in June of 2021. Myself and a number of attorneys behind the scenes who you'll probably never see were doing work to gather information, right? That 500-page report took thousands of hours to draft. And the task force is limited in time. It will sunset automatically July 1st of this year. And so again, how do you make an impact? Well, you have to give meaning to these huge policies that are passed and show that it's possible to even think about reparations regardless of and to comply with what the law calls for, regardless of the time constraints, right? California is the first state to do this. You don't want it to be a failure. And so that takes a lot of hours. The other example I would give you is California has been called out for its disparities in law enforcement. Many places have. In 2015, California passed a law called the Racial and Identity Profiling Act, which requires the gathering of stop data from all law enforcement agencies in the state. That was again phased in, but now we were in the period where all law enforcement agencies have to report their stop data annually. There's a board that has to analyze it, and then there's an annual report that's published. So the state is saying publicly on an annual basis, yes, we have disparities in who is getting stopped, and they're significant, and here they are. And that provides an opportunity for communities to be heard, although you'll be surprised by the number of folks who engage in public comment or are actually involved in attending some of these meetings. But people then can take that data and do something with it. Right? Researchers can take it and extrapolate it and control for various factors and work magic that I can't do as a lawyer, but then I can then use in court cases or in commenting publicly on policy proposals or in empowering other organizations that may not have the resources to really actively engage in this work. The other thing I'll just note that's a very much a positive impact is that once folks see it done, they can seize on those opportunities and sort of join the coalition or the cause or the movement and push it forward. When I was at the California Attorney General's office, we settled with LA County about the conditions of confinement in their juvenile halls. And that could have been the end of the story, right? We're going to go into monitoring. We'll see what the settlement agreement does. There's a whole monitoring team, and that's not what happened. What happened is a bunch of community groups who've been very active in that county for decades on this issue said, we want to go further. Let's close another juvenile hall. Let's build this momentum. And so even though a particular item or task or policy may seem relatively small, it can start the dominoes falling. And I think that that can be very positive for communities. And it's not necessarily limited to a particular issue, but we do build upon the lessons that we've learned historically and tactically. And so I really see that even though these laws aren't perfect and new policies sometimes need to be amended or corrected, we've been trying more in this area than we have, and I see that as possible laboratories, particularly at the state and local levels where we can get new initiatives passed.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
Thank you. And so impressive and inspiring, this work. And thank you for beginning to take us towards the future. You all have accomplished amazing things and are working on amazing things. And we also have the next generation of lawyers coming up and in this room. And I want to rephrase this question. I'd written it, where do you see the greatest need in this space? I'd like to rephrase that to where do you see the greatest opportunity in this space going forward for people in the next generation to think about plugging in?
So briefly, I don't think anything happens in a sustainable way, a long-term way, until the culture changes. And every major change in rights, in particular in America, has been a shifting of the culture. And in my own family's experience, I mean, if the culture says lock them up, you will be locked up. And the Constitution, the laws simply don't matter. Now, that's, I don't want to make it too blanket a statement, but I do want to emphasize the importance of changing this culture. And so the title is really apt about, truth, racial healing and transformation. And it begins with truth. And, Sarah talked about the Racial Justice Act, the Racial Profiling Act in California, and data. So if there is disparities, biases, racial biases in arrests, in charging, in decisions about diversion, in decisions about sentencing, the Racial Justice Act theoretically gives a defendant the right to say, I believe that, I was sentenced to longer term for the same crime committed by a white person. How do they prove that? Well, you can't until there's data. And so there are opportunities on the local level to begin to do that, but the culture has to push that along such that the legislature then would have the political will to actually do something about these things. And so the truth part is, I think we begin with that. And every social movement, I think, has to have intellectual foundation that justifies that shifting. And we've seen it, happen. Marriage equality is a good example where the velocity of change has been astounding. I mean, California passed Prop 8 banning same-sex marriage. And then with that, in how many years, the culture shifted. So the transformation or the change from Jim Crow America to at least on paper, the courts, outlawing de jure discrimination is a culture shift. But we have a lot more work to do. So conferences like this have become crucial. As everybody knows, the U.S. Supreme Court generationally is set based upon historical events. And so I think the shift is local and regional. And a good example is after the Japanese American Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was passed, giving some monetary atonement to Japanese Americans and an education fund. The very next year, 1989, Congressman John Conyers from Detroit introduced a very much pattern after our bill, a similar bill calling for the study of reparations. It wasn't even anything to do with money, but just to study it. And 34 years later, it hasn't even gotten to a floor vote. So Congress has not shown the will even to study this issue, let alone do anything about it. So California and about 40 other cities and counties throughout the country have now started their own, let's take a look at this. Let's seriously consider it. And obviously a city does not have the resources to provide reparations, which was a national policy that everybody joined in on. But it begins the truth part. The truth part is critical in shaping the culture. And lawyers, I think, have to be, if we're serious about social change, have to be engaging, at that level. And the opportunities exist on a local level. And with the idea of, the pebble in the water and the rippling, reverberations out to the broader community. I'll stop here on that.
So the question is interesting, and I think for your generation, the focus is probably going to be on what's the agency of the work for transformation. So we are in a time where we need to transform our institutions, otherwise our very survival is in jeopardy, right? I mean, climate change is real. What we are experiencing in terms of social unrest and civil rights violations is real. This is a very, very important time to think about, do our institutions work for us? And if they don't, how do we want to transform them? So the promise of the work for your generation is to be not afraid to name what isn't working and to create better structures. For Native people, there have been, I guess, two real efforts by Congress to atone for things that it did. One was the Indian Claims Commission Act in the 1940s, which basically was to acknowledge the land dispossession and to, make some sort of a limited effort to repair that. And the second one was the NAGPRA statute that I talked about. Now, both of those are incomplete, but they do talk about the fact that land-based peoples, indigenous peoples as land-based peoples, have these unique governments and cultures that have a form of political and cultural sovereignty in the United States that no other people have. And that is recognized regardless of whether the federal government federally recognizes a tribe. It is a human rights construct that all indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, that right of autonomy in a people to control the destiny, its future. That's also an individual autonomy, right? That's why we have a Bill of Rights, because we recognize individual autonomy as having a moral value that needs to be recognized in a constitutional structure. What does that mean for you guys? Well, who is the United States as a people? It is a composite of these histories. It's a composite of these experiences. The power is when you come together without needing everybody to meet some model of a democratic citizen that never did and still doesn't exist. The power is to reclaim those histories at the point now that you can leverage it. So what I care about is environment. And I see tribal governments in the forefront of having some of the most protective levels of environmental protection. And this is happening a lot in California in terms of the salmon and like the Yurok, and looking at the rivers and claiming them in indigenous language as persons that are related to the tribe, that deserve, that merit protection. Then the United States goes and says, well, do they have standing? Don't even worry about it. Yes. And that's not a constitutional law answer. That's a human rights answer, because somebody has to protect that river. Somebody has to protect the salmon. And if you look globally, indigenous peoples globally are less than 5% of the world's population. They live on about 20 to 25% of the Earth's land mass. 80% of the world's biodiversity is on that land mass. And that's what's happening in the international scheme. How are we going to survive into the future? How are we going to care for these lands and peoples? So I could tell you beautiful stories of allyship, where in these towns that are reconciling terrible histories, the descendants of those people who maybe did terrible things, the descendants are saying, we want to put this right. We are part of this land too now. We need to work together. And those are some of the most powerful stories ever. That's who we are as a country. And that is the promise that we have into the future. The last thought I'm going to leave you with, don't be afraid of the realm that we describe as the spiritual. It's not the religious. It is what makes human beings distinctive. And if you look at the agency of healing within Native traditional systems, that is what allows survival. That is the emotion that we feel when we hear hard stories or when we connect to each other after a catastrophe. The George Floyd murder was such a terrible, terrible thing. But did you see how that catastrophe brought people together? The pandemic was a terrible, terrible thing, still is. But did you see how people came together? That is the power that you have as human beings. You can't delegate your consciousness to a machine. I know they're trying, but it's not going to work. It's with you. Thank you.
That's hard to follow. Okay, so opportunities. I think we should be looking, and this is something that I've been working with some of my students on, are creative uses for existing anti-discrimination statutes. So in California, we're very lucky in that we have a number of state anti-discrimination statutes, but we have new needs for them. How are they going to respond to the environmental justice context, right? How are we going to try and push the law in ways that are useful to us? So I think that's a really big piece, is looking at the statutes that we have and trying to use them in new ways. I will also tell you that the courts are not always going to be the answer. And so we have to think about other options and other tools that we have in our toolbox. Talk to you a little bit about policy advocacy. I just want to remind you, and I'm sure you all know this, that we're not only going to see linear progress, right? The pendulum is going to swing. And so trust and time are things that I think we need to focus on. As an example, when in California, we used to push out a lot of children of color, we still do, students of color, for what we called willful defiance. It was a part of our education code, and the numbers that showed the disparities were really high. And years ago now, we said we should just get rid of that part of the education code. I was at a convening earlier this year, this school year, and we were talking about, the success that we finally had in passing that bill. And somebody had to remind us, it took us 10 years to get there and multiple tries. So that coalition of stakeholders had worked together for a very long time, that have built trust to know that we were all aligned on the same goals and have been committed. And so in thinking about the legal work that you're going to do on truth and racial healing and transformation, it's not going to be fast. And so you're going to get to celebrate all of the victories along the way, and there will be some, and sometimes there'll be pushback, right? So in the school context, after the George Floyd's murder, we saw a lot of districts say, you know what, because of the school to prison pipeline, because of these disparities, we need to take law enforcement out of our schools. And if you read the news today, a lot of districts are saying, actually, we want to put those law enforcement officers back. And so again, cyclical, but it's the same sort of battle that you already had comes back again. And so I would just remind you that there are great opportunities, but there are also going to be moments when you're going to sort of be like, oh, this feels rough. And that's okay. Because you have a lot of lawyers who have come before us, who have managed to stay in it for the long haul, and who have seen progress that may not come immediately, but sort of builds up over time, as we've talked about.
That was fantastic. Thank you, all three of you. And can we get a huge round of applause for our panelists? Okay, so on the topic of agency, to use a heavy-handed transition, we have a little bit of extra time in our schedule before our next bit of programming in this room. So we have some options for you. You can choose your own adventure. For folks who are interested in engaging further with our panelists who want to engage that way, we will have time for Q&A here. You can come meet them. We can do that. For folks who need a little bit of a break, and there's been a lot of heavy topics, you can take a break out in the plaza, get water, refresh. I think Robert has planned to do a guided meditation. So he can meet folks out in the plaza. If you want to do that, you can meet folks and network. You can do whatever you need to resource yourself. So feel free, you can do some combo of those things. You can come outside, come back in, but you're welcome to do that. I'll give folks time to move, and then we'll start to take Q&A from the folks who want to stick around.